Would you like to learn how to read the Old Testament in the original Hebrew in which it was written? Have you been interested in perhaps getting a seminary quality education in biblical Hebrew, but don't have the money or time to be able to attend a brick and mortar or online institution in order to get that education? Well, then this series, Biblical Hebrew 101, is for you, beginning with this lecture, Lecture 1, on the Hebrew Alef-Bet. Hi, this is Chris Date, and welcome to Theapologetics, where every other week I discuss a wide variety of theological issues and show how a properly biblical worldview can help defend the historic Christian faith from its critics. Join me as we think through what we believe and why we believe it, and not something else. Well, hello, and welcome to this first lecture in the series I'm calling Hebrew 101. This lecture is an introduction to biblical Hebrew, and specifically goes into detail on the Hebrew alphabet, which I'm calling the Hebrew Alef-Bet, for reasons that you will learn momentarily. This lecture series will be based on the grammar called Basics of Biblical Hebrew, the second edition of it, by Pratico and Van Pelt. So if you would like to follow along in the Hebrew grammar, you can find a copy of Basics of Biblical Hebrew, second edition, in paperback or on Logos Bible software or on Kindle or what have you. And I'd encourage you to follow along in that grammar, but by no means must you follow along in order to benefit from this lecture series. So if you follow along and if you invest time in studying just what you learn in this series, the grammar will be nice, but by no means necessary. Now, before I dive into the topic of this lecture, as I will do in future lectures as well, I want to begin with something of a warm-up, something to get your mind into the sort of headspace, to get into the headspace of learning biblical Hebrew. And in this warm-up, at the beginning of every lecture, I want to introduce you to two things. Firstly, I want to introduce you to some Hebrew expression or idiom or phrase or word that you can use in conversational Hebrew today, in modern conversational Hebrew. And then secondly, I want to introduce you to a biblical expression that often comes to us through in the English translations via transliteration, but that actually means something in the original Hebrew that perhaps you weren't aware of. All right? So what I want to begin with is that first thing I mentioned, a phrase or word that you can use in conversational Hebrew today. And in this very first lecture, we're going to start very easy with the Hebrew word shalom. Shalom is a word that appears in the biblical Hebrew as well. It literally means peace, although the concept in biblical Hebrew of peace is much more than mere cessation of military activity or mere agreement between parties not to fight or something like that. It's much more profound than that. It's about completeness and wholeness. But that's a rough and ready English translation of the word. But in conversational Hebrew today, shalom very often functions the way that aloha does in Hawaiian, namely as a simple greeting. Hello, shalom. And it can also equally serve as a casual goodbye in the way that aloha does. So at the beginning of a conversation with a Hebrew speaker, you could say shalom. And then again at the end, to say goodbye in a casual, informal way, you can say shalom. Up on your screen next to the word hello in English is the Hebrew characters that make up the word shalom. You'll be able to recognize those. Actually, by the end of this lecture, you'll be able to recognize those letters and understand why they're pronounced shalom with a certain degree of understanding. And then the second lecture in this series will fill the gaps. Now, as for a biblical word or expression that comes through in our English translations via transliteration rather than actual translation, I want to look at the word that we're familiar with in even in the New Testament, and I think, if I'm remembering correctly, but also in hymns and songs and things that we sing, the word hallelujah or alleluia. That is very often transliterated rather than translated. For those of you who don't know, transliteration is not the process of capturing the meaning of a word in a source language by representing the same meaning in the destination language. That's translation. Transliteration is taking the sounds that make up a word in a source language and reproducing those sounds in the destination language. So using the destination language's letters and symbols in order to reproduce as close as possible the sound as the word makes in the original language. So in this case, the English transliteration is hallelujah or alleluia, but that's a transliteration of the Hebrew phrase hallelujah, which is a command to a group of people to praise the Lord. So you might translate it, praise ye the Lord, where ye is the plural of you. Or if you want to have a American Southern way of putting it, you could say, y'all praise the Lord, or something like that. That's literally what hallelujah means. So next time you see hallelujah or alleluia in the biblical text in your English translations, or if next time you sing it in a hymn or a song, now you know what it is that you are actually saying. All right, so hopefully that gets you warmed up. Shalom, hello, and hallelujah, praise God with me. Let's go ahead and dive into the topic proper of this first lecture in Hebrew 101, which is an introduction to Biblical Hebrew. So before we actually dive into the Hebrew Alef-Bet, I want to introduce you to the language from a higher level, more broadly. As I said in the introduction, we are going to be talking about the Hebrew Alef-Bet today. You might have recognized that that's awfully similar to the word alphabet, and indeed the grammar that this lecture series is based on calls the Hebrew consonants a alphabet. It's the Hebrew alphabet, but very many people, including myself, refer to it as the Hebrew Alef-Bet. And the reason for that is because the first two letters, consonants, in the Hebrew alphabet are the letters Aleph and Bet. If you pronounce bait quickly enough, it just comes out bet, and so you have Alef-Bet, the Alef-Bet. In fact, the reason why the first and second letters of the English alphabet are A and B go back to, in part, the fact that the first two letters in the Greek alphabet were alpha and beta, which themselves are in part because Hebrew in the first two characters are Aleph and Bet. Consider how close those are. Aleph, alpha. Bet, beta. You see how close they are. So there's a linguistic and historical connection here, but that's not the topic here. The point is just that I'm going to be referring to the letters of the Hebrew alphabet as the Alef-Bet for the reason that I've just explained. Now, unlike English, which is written from left to right, Hebrew is much like some other languages which read right to left. Also, unlike English, which has both consonants and vowels represented in the alphabet, vowels A, E, I, O, and U, and consonants B, C, D, F, G, H, and so forth, the Hebrew Alef-Bet, strictly speaking, consists only of consonants. We will be covering vowels in the second lecture, but they will be not part of the alphabet or Alef-Bet. The Alef-Bet is only consonants. Most letters in the Hebrew Alef-Bet, these consonants, fit within an imaginary square or rectangular frame. Most of them, as you can see on your screen, do fit within something of a square. Some of them are narrower and fit within a narrow rectangle, but it still helps to picture writing these characters or printing these characters within an imaginary square frame. And notice that only one of the characters extends above the top border of that frame, and only a few of the characters extend down below the bottom border of the frame. Hebrew, by one count, namely the count reflected in the grammar upon which this lecture series is based, according to this count, the Hebrew Alef-Bet consists of 23 consonants. Now, I say one count because there are other ways of counting the number of letters in the Alef-Bet, and the other ways are based on a different handling of the characters that I've got highlighted in red on the screen right now. So more often than the claim that Hebrew has 23 consonants is the claim that Hebrew has 22 consonants. And the reason is because they treat those two left characters at the end that I've got colored red. And when I say end, remember, I'm talking right to left, so on the left end. Most accountings of the number of characters in the Hebrew Alef-Bet treat those two as a single character, a character without the dot that is on either side of those two characters. On the other hand, there are ways of counting the Hebrew consonants in such a way as to result in 26 characters. This is particularly true when sung by children in Alef-Bet songs. The characters in red are treated twice, once with a dot and once without, in the cases of the first, second, and third characters, again moving from right to left, or a dot on the left side or the right side, as in the last two cases. So this ends up not with 23 or 22, but 26. And in fact, there's still other times where you might count even over 30 of them, because some of these characters take a different form when they are at the ends of words. You'll learn that in today's lecture. And some ways of counting the Hebrew consonants treat those final forms as though they are separate consonants in the count from the ones from the same form of the same exact letter, but in the middle of words or at the beginnings of words. So the point of all of this is just to say, don't fret too much, don't worry too much about knowing how many characters are in the Hebrew Alef-Bet. You can say 22 or 23 or even 26, and you're going to be right depending upon whom you're speaking to. But a good rough and ready number is 23, again, assuming that you treat those last two characters in red as if they are two characters rather than one. Now, the script for writing Hebrew that you will most encounter in your studies of Biblical Hebrew is one like the one that is on the screen now, called square or block print. This is a relatively modern invention, and like English and other languages, this script can be represented in multiple fonts and styles. The one that you will encounter most in your studies will look very much like this, the one that's up on the screen right now, but you will also possibly encounter other fonts, not necessarily these ones if you're looking at, in biblical studies, but if you are, browsing the web or walking down the streets in Israel or something like that, you might encounter these letters in fonts other than the one you're most familiar with. So just be on the lookout for those. But again, familiarity with the top row on this slide suffices for biblical studies. But this script isn't the only way of writing Hebrew. Just as with English, you can write in plain writing or in cursive, which looks significantly different, at least in many letters, than regular printed English. So too, there's a handwriting script, sometimes called a cursive script, for writing Hebrew, which in a number of cases looks very different, almost unrecognizable as compared to the block or square script. And so you may see these and not realize you're looking at Hebrew. But even beyond this script, there are still others, albeit more ancient ones. So stretching back into ancient history, you will find that Hebrew was written in a number of different scripts, including the ones on your screen here. You do not need to memorize these or the handwritten ones on the previous slide in order to do well in biblical studies if you're trying to develop a mastery of biblical Hebrew. But if you do want to go into some sort of scholarship that involves a study of ancient Near Eastern iconography, if you see Hebrew written on ancient tablets or something like that, you might be, if you're not aware that ancient Hebrew looks different than modern Hebrew, you might not realize what you're looking at. So don't expect to be easily able to read ancient Hebrew if you become very familiar with modern biblical script. So I just wanted to have you be aware of those things. Now, it's not only the script in which Hebrew is written that has changed over time. The language itself has changed over time, just as all languages do. In fact, just the biblical Hebrew alone in the Old Testament, from Genesis to Malachi, represents several historical stages of biblical Hebrew. So there will be some differences that over time you will become familiar with, so that you can better tell what something means in a later part of the a part of of the Old Testament that was written later in history than an earlier one, that kind of thing. That's not important right now, but it is important to be aware that the biblical text represents multiple stages of Hebrew. And a sort of rough analogy, an imperfect analogy for the difference between biblical Hebrew and modern Hebrew is something like the difference between modern English and Old English. Maybe not as far back as Beowulf or something like that, but you look at written English text from 200-300 years ago, and you're going to find that although you can make sense of a lot of it, there will be some differences. And if you were to go around speaking as if you were writing English 200-300 years ago, you're going to seem very strange to a lot of people. And the same is true of biblical Hebrew. If you go around speaking biblical Hebrew to modern native Hebrew speakers, you're going to sound a little bit weird. And importantly, the course that we're going through here, this series, Biblical Hebrew 101, is not going to equip you to converse with modern Hebrew speakers beyond these greetings and expressions that I'm going to be teaching you in the warm-up at the beginning of every lecture. But one of the reasons why I am warming you up in that way is because I do want to spark your interest in getting equipped to be able to speak modern conversational Hebrew. For the record, I'm not yet equipped. This is to spark my own interest as well. But the point here is just that by studying these lectures, you will develop some proficiency in reading biblical Hebrew, but you will not develop a proficiency in any degree conversing in Hebrew with modern Hebrew speakers. Now, I mentioned that the Hebrew Alef-Bet consists only of consonants, but by the time of around 1000 AD or CE, markings had become standardized that are sometimes added to aid in pronunciation. And by added, I mean they are added to the consonants in the form of markings primarily underneath those consonants, but sometimes above and inside them as well. And so that's how printed Hebrew that captures the vowel sounds, that's how they do it. And that's how they're able to do it when the Alef-Bet only contains consonants. And the way that these markings work is that as you're, it's nothing like this in actual practice, but when you're learning, the way it works is that the consonant is pronounced first, and then immediately thereafter you pronounce whatever vowel marking is marking that consonant. So in this word, for example, that's on the screen right now, Elohim, which means God, the consonants are the block square-like, the block script letters, and then the dots below and above them are the vowel markings. And what I've tried to do beneath the word Elohim is to sort of split apart the consonants and the vowels. So I've got the first consonant on the far right, Aleph, in a square of its own, and then I've moved the vowel markings from underneath the Aleph to a square of its own with a dotted circle representing the letter that it's under in the same square, so that you can see that first you're pronouncing that first character, the Aleph, and then you're pronouncing the vowel sound. And then you're producing the next consonant, which is the Lamed, and then you're pronouncing the vowel marking that's on it, and so forth. If this doesn't make a lot of sense right now, it will in time, don't worry. But you might almost think of this as reading not just right to left, but right to left and up and down, right? So you're starting at the consonant, and then you're going down to the vowel markings, and then back up to the consonant, and then down to the vowel markings, and back up to the consonant. And so it's almost kind of like a wave. That's visually how the pronunciation is represented. That might be a helpful way to think of it. Don't fret if this isn't making a whole lot of sense right now. It will in hopefully by the end of next lecture. Now, as for transliteration, which is a concept I described earlier, Hebrew transliteration into English is standardized in just normal day-to-day books and articles and blog posts and things like that. There isn't a standardized Hebrew transliteration. But if you're looking at scholarly literature, particularly biblical studies literature, there is a standardized transliteration system, and many biblical studies resources use this standard. And so it's important to learn, as you're learning the Hebrew Alef-Bet, how to transliterate those consonants into English in the standardized way. And that way, when you're reading these resources that use transliterated Hebrew rather than the Hebrew script itself, you'll be able to recognize what the actual Hebrew is more easily than if you're not familiar with the transliteration. Now, unlike the Hebrew itself, which is written from right to left, the transliteration in English is written from left to right, just like all English. So here on the screen again is that word Elohim, and again I've separated under it all of the consonants and vowels. I split them apart from one another. And each of the consonants and vowels are transliterated into English using a particular symbol or letter. So going from right to left, the Aleph is transliterated using that little rightward pointed apostrophe-like symbol, and then the vowel marking under the Aleph, which is called a Chatef Sagol, is transliterated using an E with a little downward pointed, like a little half circle on top of it, and then the Lamed is represented by an L, the next vowel marking by an O, and so on and so forth as you transliterate the Hebrew into English. But when you put these pieces together in a transliteration of the Hebrew word Elohim, it's written from left to right. And indeed, it looks like Elohim in English. You'd be able to say, oh, that even if you weren't familiar with the word, you would know that. You would try to say like Elohim or something like that. So you can see that the transliteration does transliterate from left to right, even though what you're transliterating is written from right to left. So with that introduction out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into the actual letters of the Hebrew Alef-Bet so that you can start to practice them and learn them and memorize them. And we'll go ahead and dive right in. But first, I just want to have you aware, keeping an eye out for three important categories of these letters. Firstly is a category of letters called gutturals. Secondly is a category of letters that is often called the Begad Kafatz letters. And then finally, there's a category of letters that, as I said earlier, take a final form. They're printed a little bit differently at the end of words than in the middle or beginning. And I will explain the significance of each of these categories when we encounter them as I go through the Hebrew Alef-Bet. And we'll begin the Hebrew Alef-Bet with the first letter in the Hebrew Alef-Bet, which is, as I said earlier, Aleph. Aleph. Aleph is the name of this letter, and the way that the grammar of this lecture series is based on spells the name Aleph is as A-L-E-F. You might also see it spelled as A-L-E-P-H. Either way is fine. You don't need to learn the transliteration of the name Aleph or even the Hebrew using the actual Hebrew characters to spell the name Aleph, but I've got them on the slide as with the other letters in case you'd like to learn. And the Aleph is not pronounced in the way that many grammars teach biblical Hebrew. They will tell you, and this grammar tells you, that the Aleph is silent, but that's not entirely accurate. This character and one other in the Hebrew Alef-Bet are not truly silent. They represent what's called a glottal stop. A glottal stop is when you have breath flowing out through your throat and out through your mouth, and then you very briefly stop the flow of breath and then let it go again. And the best way I have found to illustrate this is by using the indefinite article followed by the word apple. Normally we would replace with an because apple begins with a vowel, but try to say it without an. Try to pronounce it with just the article apple, apple, apple. You hear that little very brief break between and apple, apple. That's a glottal stop. And that's what this character and one other character in the Hebrew Alef-Bet represent. Not extremely critical that you remember that. You can treat it as silent. Just be aware that it is in fact a sound, and it's a sound that in some cases will be more pronounced than you would think if you're thinking of this strictly as a silent consonant. Now, the way that Aleph is transliterated into English is using, again, as I mentioned earlier, a rightward pointed apostrophe-like symbol. You take a half circle and you split it down the middle vertically, and then take away the left side of the left piece of that split down the middle circle, and that's what you're left with is the transliteration of the Hebrew letter Aleph. You could also think of it as like a bowl that has been turned on its side with the open side of the bowl facing to the left. You could also think of it as the convex edge of the little half circle pointed to the right. Number of different ways to think about it, but this is the symbol that is used to transliterate the Aleph into English. And there are a couple of examples I'll offer of Hebrew words that begin with this consonant are the Hebrew words Av, meaning father, and Even, meaning stone. Now, this is the first consonant in the Hebrew Alef-Bet that is a part of that first category I mentioned, the gutturals. So let's talk about the gutturals for a moment. The gutturals are so called because they're pronounced in the back of the throat, at least to one degree or another, more so than the other letters in the Hebrew Alef-Bet. And the reason why these are grouped together in a category called the gutturals is because gutturals follow certain special rules in certain circumstances that other letters don't follow. You won't learn any of those rules in this lecture, but you will in future ones, and so you need to be familiar with which consonants fall into this category. Now, the last character, the one that I've put in parentheses toward the top of the slide, that character is called resh, and you'll learn it shortly. And it's not technically a guttural, but it is often treated as one because it often acts like one. It often follows those special rules that gutturals do in certain circumstances. So for all intents and purposes, you can think of resh as a guttural, but just know that in a strictly technical sense, it's not, for reasons that I can't articulate. The next consonant in Hebrew Alef-Bet is called bet. Bet. And the reason that I've put two versions of it will become evident in a moment, but let's just talk about the version of it that has a dot in the middle. Again, this is the letter bet, and it's pronounced like the letter B in the English word boy. For that reason, it is transliterated as an English B. And a couple of examples of Hebrew words that start with the bet are the Hebrew words bain, meaning sun, not S-U-N like the sun shining up in the sky, but sun like my boy, my little boy, my son. And another example is boker, meaning morning. Now, the reason why I showed you two forms of this consonant a moment ago is because this is the first of a few consonants that fall into the second category I told you about, called the Begad Kafatz consonants. But before I walk you through what this category, what's significant about it, let me talk briefly about the other form of this same consonant, the one that lacks that dot. This is still the letter bet, although sometimes it is treated as a separate letter from bet called vet. And that is a clue that unlike the way this is pronounced with the dot, without the dot it's pronounced like the letter V in vine. So it's not B as in boy, but V as in vine. But because it is still the same consonant in the original text, it's still transliterated using the English character B, but to indicate that there isn't a dot in the center of it, when it is transliterated, a line is put under the B as a way of indicating that this represents the version of this consonant that doesn't have that dot. Now, I've given an example here of a word that begins with this consonant when it lacks the dot, but for reasons that you will learn a little bit more next lecture, this rarely will appear without a dot at the beginning of a word. One exception is when it follows the word and so after the word and, the word vein, notice it's spelled a little bit differently from bane that we saw in the previous slide. The word vein after the word and in this case would mean between. So vein. So let's talk about these Begad Kafatz consonants. Begad Kafat is a mnemonic. It's a memory device where each of the consonants in the device, B, G, D, K, F, and T, correspond to Hebrew consonants that start with that sound, and then the vowels in between are just meant to, smooth it out into a memorable mnemonic. And when each of these characters starts a word, and immediately following a consonant sound, these characters, when they have a dagesh, these characters will take a dot called a dagesh, which we'll talk about in a moment, whereas when they are not at the beginning of a word, or when they don't immediately follow a consonant sound, they are rendered without that dot. And so Begad Kafat is just a way of remembering which of these consonants take a dot at the beginning and at the beginning of words and immediately after consonants, and lack that dot when not in those circumstances. This dot that appears in these characters at the beginnings of words or immediately following after consonants, this dot is called a dagesh lena, which means a weak dagesh. Lena is it's a form of the Latin word lenus, which means weak. And this Dagesh Lena, changes the sound of 3 of these 6 Begad Kavats consonants in a way that I will illustrate momentarily. 3 others, however, don't change the sound. Now, this Dagesh, let me talk about the Dagesh for a moment. You'll learn more about this in the next lecture. The word Dagesh means emphasis, and there are 2 kinds. One I've just introduced you to, the Dagesh Lena, or in Hebrew they would say the Dagesh Kal, meaning weak. And then a second one that you will learn more about next lecture called the Dagesh Forte. Not forte. Forte is Italian. It's in musical, it's on music manuscripts to indicate loud. This is not that. This is a form of the Latin word fortis, meaning strong. In Hebrew, it would be chazak. So Dagesh chazak, or to use the Latin word, Dagesh Forte, meaning strong. And again, you'll learn about that Dagesh in the next lecture, but this lecture I'm teaching you about the Dagesh Lena, or Dagesh Kal. What this Dagesh does to those consonants that I mentioned have their sounds change is it hardens what would otherwise be a soft sound for that consonant. So remember, the bait with a dot, I told you, makes the sound of a B, like in the Hebrew, or in the English word boy, whereas without a dot, it makes a sound like a V in the English word vine. And that's the hardening I'm talking about. Without the Dagesh, it's a V, V, V. Add the Dagesh and it gets harder. It goes from a V, V to a B, B. But it only does that in modern Hebrew speakers, or for modern Hebrew speakers, it only does it for 3 of the 6 consonants, including bait. It does not do them for others. For those others, Gimel, Dalet, and Taf, which you will learn a little bit later today, moderns don't pronounce them any differently with the Dagesh than they do without the Dagesh. There is a exception in certain dialects of modern Hebrew. One of these characters, the last one, Taf, is pronounced differently without the dot than with, but that's not something that you will encounter a whole lot. And besides, this series isn't meant to teach you how to converse with modern Hebrew speakers. But you'll be able to easily look that up if you're interested in learning more. So here, this chart on the slide kind of illustrates the way that some of these Begad Kavat consonants change sound in modern Hebrew, with or without the Dagesh. So the first one on the top of the list is the consonant that we're looking at now, bait. Without the Dagesh, it's pronounced like a V sound. With the Dagesh, it's pronounced like a B sound. The next 2, Gimel and Dalet, do not change in modern Hebrew pronunciation, but the next one down does. The Hebrew consonant Kaf, when it lacks the Dagesh, is a ch sound that we'll talk about in a little bit, and with the Dagesh, it's a hard K sound. The next one down, the Pe, also is pronounced differently with the Dagesh than without. Without, it sounds like a PH sound, and with the with the Dagesh Lena, it makes a P sound, and then the Taf at the bottom in most modern Hebrew dialects does not change its sound with or without the Dagesh. And again, I'll teach you more about these when we get to those individual consonants. But that's an introduction to the Dagesh, and with that, we'll move on to the next slide, the next consonant in the Hebrew Alef-Bet, which is the letter Gimel. Gimel. This is pronounced, when it has the Dagesh Lena, as the letter G in the word God. Actually, it's pronounced that way even without. We'll get to that in a minute. It is, for that reason, transliterated as with the English letter G. And a couple of examples of Hebrew words that start with Gimel are Gadol, which means great or big, and Goy, which means nation or even Gentile. Goy is where the word Goyim comes from, and Goyim is the Hebrew way of referring to Gentiles. Now, this is the second letter in our category of Begad Kafat's consonants, which means that it can go without a Dagesh Lena as well. But, as I mentioned earlier, its pronunciation does not change in modern Hebrew pronunciation. And so, because it's the same consonant as the Gimel with the Dagesh, it is transliterated using the English letter G. But to indicate that the Gimel does not have the Dagesh, it is transliterated with a line over the top of the G. One example of this word, again, you're not going to encounter a Gimel without a Dagesh at the beginning of a word in most cases. One exception is when it follows the word and. So when the word gam follows the word and, there will not be a dagesh in the gimel. And gam means also. Next consonant in the Hebrew Alef-Bet is the letter dalet. Dalet. The character dalet sounds like the English letter D in the word day, or dog, or duck, duck, so on and so forth, for which reason it is transliterated into English using the letter D. A couple of examples of Hebrew words that start with dalet are dag, which ironically is not a dog, but a fish, and derech, which means road or way or path. And this is the third of the 6 begad kafat consonants, which means it has a form that lacks the dagesh lena. But like gimel, its pronunciation does not change in modern Hebrew pronunciation. Without the dagesh, it's still pronounced as the D in the English word day. Again, it's the same consonant, it's just missing the dot, and so it's still transliterated using the English letter D, but without the dagesh, it is transliterated with a line under the D. And an example of when this word without the dagesh would appear, an example of a word that begins with this letter without the dagesh when it follows the word and, is the word dagan, which means grain. Next consonant in the Hebrew Alef-Bet is the letter hey. Hey. It is pronounced like the letter H in hay or house, or the W and H in who, and so forth. And for that reason, it is transliterated into English using the English letter H. And some examples of Hebrew words that start with the letter hey are the words he, ironically meaning she, and the word who, meaning he. This is something of a mnemonic itself, a way to remember how to say he and she in Hebrew. You could say who is he and he is she, meaning who in Hebrew is he in English, and he in Hebrew is she in English. So it can be a little bit confusing at first, but like I said, just remember who is he and he is she, and it'll become clear. And this is the second of our consonants that qualifies as a guttural, and we'll learn the others shortly. The next consonant in the Hebrew Alef-Bet is the letter Vav, or wow in older ways of pronouncing Biblical Hebrew. We'll talk about that in just a moment. So, assuming for the time being that we would pronounce this wow, it is pronounced like the letter W in the English word way, for which reason it is transliterated into English using the letter W. And an example, in fact, probably the most common, by far, example of Hebrew words that begin with the letter Vav is the word and, which is just the Hebrew letter Vav with a symbol under it called a shavah that we will learn about next lecture. Now, the reason why I introduced this as the letter Vav rather than the letter wow, in fact, I think I just slipped a moment ago and said Vav instead of wow, is because moderns pronounce this letter as Vav, or as a V in vine, just like the bait without the dagesh. So pronouncing it as a W, as in wow, is not common today in spoken Hebrew. Within biblical studies, there are still some holdouts that pronounce it as a W, but throughout this series, you will hear me pronounce it as a V in vine, and you will hear me pronounce its name as Vav. So just be aware of that. Now, you've got to make a choice as a student of Biblical Hebrew which pronunciation you want to use, and I won't strongly encourage you to do one or the other. I have made the choice to pronounce it like a V because I do want to be able to converse with modern Hebrew speakers at some point, and it'll be easier, I think, to transition from pronouncing this as a V than if I got used to pronouncing it as a W. So make the choice yourself. Remember that it's transliterated as a W no matter how you pronounce it. But just know that when you hear me pronounce it, I'll be pronouncing it like a V, and I'll be calling the letter Vav rather than wow. Next consonant in Hebrew Alef-Bet is Zayin. Zayin. Zayin is pronounced like the letter Z in the English transliteration Zion, or in the English word zebra. for which reason it is transliterated into English using the English letter Z. And the Hebrew words zahav, meaning gold, and zakain, meaning old, are both examples of Hebrew words that start with a zayin. The next consonant in the Hebrew Alef-Bet is chet. Chet. Now, this is going to be a little bit challenging for some of you. Your grammars will often say that it's pronounced like the English letters C and H in the name Bach, or the C and H at the end of the Scottish word Loch, like Loch Ness. And that's a rough and ready sort of, that's a way to get used to it. But the problem is that, if I'm not mistaken, the CH in Bach and in Lach, they're a little softer, to put it one way, than the sound that this letter makes in Hebrew. In Hebrew, it's a wetter sound and a rougher sound than the CH in Bach and Lach. This almost sounds like you're clearing your throat. Chet. Not chet, but chet. And this is, by the way, why it's not called Chanukah. Very often you'll see Hanukkah written with a CH at the beginning, but it's not Chanukah, it's Hanukkah. So just try to remember, you can think of CH as sort of the way to remember how to pronounce this, but try to remember that you're doing more of a throat clearing. It's wetter, it's rougher, and that's why sometimes Hebrew has a reputation for being a spittly language, is because you're doing a lot of these throat clearing sounds. The way to transliterate chet into English is by using the English letter H, but with a dot under it. And examples of Hebrew words that start with this letter are chai, meaning life, and chen, meaning favor or grace. And this is the third letter in our category of gutturals, for what are hopefully obvious reasons. Next consonant in the Hebrew Alef-Bet is the letter tet. Tet. This makes the sound of a T in the English word toy, or ton, or tub, or tea, or tap, and so on and so forth. For that reason, it is transliterated using the English letter T, but to differentiate it from another letter that makes this sound that we'll learn later, it is rendered with a dot under the T when it is transliterated. Examples of Hebrew words that start with tet are tov, meaning good. In fact, this is where the phrase mazel tov comes from, which means good luck, good job, good tidings, something along those lines. Tov means good. And tavach means cook, like a chef, somebody who cooks. The next consonant in the Hebrew Alef-Bet is the letter yod. Yod. Yod is pronounced like the letter Y in the English words yes and yellow and yesterday, for which reason it is transliterated using the English letter Y. And Hebrew words that start with yod include yad, meaning hand, and yom, meaning day. Next letter is kaf. And here again, I'm exposing you to multiple forms, but this time it's not two forms, it's three, and the reasons for that will become apparent momentarily if they're not already. Let's first talk about the letter kaf with the dagesh lena. When it has the dagesh lena, it is pronounced like the letter K in the English word king, for which reason it is transliterated into English using the English letter K. And examples of Hebrew words that begin with the kaf include kohen, which is the word meaning priest. If you've ever heard of somebody whose last name is Cohen, that's the word kohen, meaning priest. And the word kesef, meaning silver or money. As you will have hopefully remembered, because I mentioned that this makes this sound when it has a dagesh, this is the next letter in our begad kafatz consonants. But it's also the first letter in the category I've yet to introduce you to, which is the final forms consonants, the consonants that take final forms. So let's switch over to the form of this letter without the dagesh and its final form. When it appears without the dagesh, it is pronounced just like the chet, as a ch at the end of bach or lach, but wetter and rougher. So this is the sound. And it's transliterated. Remember, this is the same consonant as kaf with a dagesh, and so it's still transliterated using the K, but to indicate that it's missing the dagesh, it has a line under the K. And because this is a begad kafat consonant, it's rarely going to start a word without the dagesh, but one example following a word like and is the Hebrew word chol, meaning all. Normally this would be kol, but without the dagesh, it would be chol. That means all. Now, the other form, the form that also lacks a dagesh, but extends down below the line, the bottom frame of the imaginary square, is the final form of this letter kaf. The consonants in this category, when they end a word, and only when they end a word, are written differently than normal. At the end of a word, these letters are written in their final forms, which are distinguished from their medial forms. The medial forms are written at the beginnings and middles of words, but at the end of words, these have a form that looks different to some extent and is called its final form. Now, one way to remember which letters are in this category is with the mnemonic chemnifets. That's not something you're going to hear all the time. It's not as in grammars and things as much as begad kafats is. So I'm not calling this the chemnifets category, but that is a helpful mnemonic because like begad kafat, in chemnifets, each consonant, or in the case of the last two, the pair of consonants, corresponds to a Hebrew consonant. So the K corresponds to kaf, the letter that we're looking at now, the M to mem, the N to nun, the F to pei, and the TS to tsari. Each of these 5 consonants looks a little bit different at the end of a word than in the middle or beginning of a word. However, there is no change to the letter's pronunciation or its transliteration when it appears at the end of a word. So you'll need to be able to recognize it, but you don't need to worry about pronouncing it any differently or transliterating it any differently. It also doesn't change the meaning of a word. It's simply a way to indicate, it's simply a way of writing the character at the end of a word. All right, so let's move on to the next letter in the Alef-Bet, which is the letter lamed. Lamed. The lamed is pronounced like the letter L in the English word lion, and it's transliterated using the English letter L. The Hebrew word lave, sometimes rendered levav, means heart, and the Hebrew word lechem, it means bread. Both of those two words start with the Hebrew letter lamed. Incidentally, the name Bethlehem, the name of the town Bethlehem, is literally the words bayit, meaning house, and lechem, meaning bread. So it's Bethlehem is Beit Lechem, or Beit Lechem, meaning house of bread. Next consonant in the Hebrew Alef-Bet is mem. And as you can see, we have 2 forms of mem, but in this case, the different isn't the lack of a dagesh or the presence of a dagesh, it's the presence of a final form. We'll talk about that in a moment. The letter mem, or mame, to enunciate the vowel sound a little bit more, is pronounced like the English letter M in mother, for which reason it is transliterated using the English letter M. Hebrew words that start with mem include mayim, meaning water, and melech, meaning king. The word Abimelech, the name Abimelech of the king, you might recognize melech at the end of that. Again, it means king. This is the second of the consonants that have final forms. The final form looks like this. You'll notice it's very similar to the mem in its medial form. It just is a closed square instead of one that has an opening in the bottom left corner, and it doesn't have a tail on the top left corner. It's also not rounded on the top like the mem kind of is. But you can hopefully see that you can recognize them. There's a certain similarity that makes them easy to recognize, that makes the final form easy to recognize. The next consonant is the consonant nun, and as you might be able to tell here, we're going to be looking at a final form consonant. The letter nun makes the sound of the English letter N in words like now and not and no, for which reason it is transliterated into English using the English letter N. And Hebrew words that start with nun include navi, meaning prophet, and nefesh, which is commonly thought to mean soul, but in the biblical text often just means life or even person. And this is, as I said, the third letter in our category of letters that take final forms. And this is also very similar to the nun in its medial form. The difference is you can imagine the tail at the bottom of the nun in its medial form being sort of folded down so that it extends below the baseline, extends below the bottom of the imaginary square frame. That's how an N looks. From that point up, it looks nigh identical to a nun in its medial form. The next consonant in the Alef-Bet is samech. Samech. The samech makes the sound of the English letter S in the word sin, or in the word sat, or in the word so, and it is therefore transliterated into English using the English letter S. And examples of Hebrew words that begin with samech include sus, meaning horse, and sefer, meaning scroll or book. Next consonant in the Hebrew Alef-Bet is the other one of our so-called silent consonants. This one is called ayin. Ayin. And the ayin is said to be silent in many biblical Hebrew grammars, but again, more technically, it's a glottal stop. Modern Hebrew speakers, some of them do hear a difference between aleph and ayin, but those of us who weren't raised to speak Hebrew are very unlikely to be able to discern much of a difference. And it is like the aleph, transliterated using an apostrophe-like symbol, sort of a sideways half circle or bowl on edge. But unlike the aleph, where the bottom of the bowl faces to the right, the bottom of the bowl on the ayin is facing to the left. And as hopefully is somewhat clear, the reason why English letters aren't used to transliterate aleph and ayin is because these don't make traditional sounds, these glottal stops, and so there's no English character that they correspond to. Examples of Hebrew words that begin with ayin include eved, meaning servant, and ad, meaning until, or as far as. And this is the fourth and last technical guttural, the fourth of the gutturals category, with one more coming up shortly. Next consonant in the Hebrew Alef-Bet is pei, and as you can probably tell, this has both a form that does not take the dagesh and a final form. Let's talk about the form with the dagesh first. The letter pei with a dagesh makes the sound of the English letter P in pastor, or papa, or pound, for which reason it is transliterated using the letter P, and Hebrew words that start with pei include peh, meaning mouth, and panim, meaning face. This is, because I just mentioned a moment ago, one of the consonants that does or does not take a dagesh lena. You'll know by now that it is one of the begad kafatz consonants. And it's also another consonant that has a final form, which is somewhat recognizable in the sense that if you take that tail at the bottom of its medial form and you fold it down beneath the baseline, you have the final form, kind of similar to what happens to the nun. Without the dagesh, the pei is pronounced like ph in alphabet, but because it's the same consonant as pei, it's transliterated using the English letter P, and to indicate that it doesn't have a dagesh, a line is written over the top of the P. And if it follows, again, just like the other begad kafatz consonants, this consonant is very unlikely to lack a dagesh at the beginning of a word, but if it follows the word and, it will, in which case it will be pronounced pachad. This word will be pronounced, fachad, meaning dread or terror. If it weren't following the word and, then it would be pronounced pachad, pachad. But if it is following the word and so it lacks that dot called the dagesh lena, it will be pronounced f, and so this word will be pronounced fachad. Next letter in the Alef-Bet is the letter tzadi, and as you can probably see, it has a final form. The letter tsadi is pronounced like the TS in the English word boots, or the TS at the beginning of the English transliteration, tsunami. Right? This isn't a simple S sound. It's not just s, it's ts, ts, almost like a hi-hat sound, right? But because it's close to the letter S sound, it is transliterated using an English letter S, but to distinguish it from the samech, which we learned earlier, a dot is placed beneath the S to indicate that this is tsadi. Also, I've put in brackets at the top that sometimes this letter is referred to as tzadik rather than as tsadi, so just be aware of that. But in your grammar, in most grammars, it'll be called tsadi. And as I said, this is a final form consonant. In fact, it's the last in our category. And you can see that it's extremely similar to the medial form of tsadi in the sense that it has sort of two horns sticking up. The difference, similar to nun and pe, is that foot that it's sitting on extends down beneath the baseline instead of flattening out at the bottom when it's at the end of a word. Next character is kof. Kof. This is a letter that makes the sound of the English letter K in king, just like kaf with a dagesh, but it is transliterated using the English letter Q. And Hebrew words that start with kof include kol, meaning sound or voice, and kadosh, meaning holy. Next character is reish, reish, and this is a very difficult letter to name and pronounce. I still am not very good at it. We Westerners and English speakers tend to want to say reish to pronounce it, and it is in our grammar said to make the sound of the letter R in the English word run. But Hebrew speakers pronounce it further back in their throat. When we say R, we sort of make a bowl with our tongue, and the tip of our tongue gets close to the roof of our mouth. But in Hebrew, the R is in the back of the throat. It's not it's reish, reish, reish. In fact, sometimes it'll almost make a rolling sound or a trill sound. Instead of reish, it might be reish. Reish. But notice that's not like the trill at when the tongue is flittered at the front of the mouth, it's in the back of the mouth. If you want to be really good at pronouncing this letter, then find some videos on YouTube, native Hebrew speakers teaching Hebrew learners how to pronounce the reish sound. You can get away with just pronouncing it like It's going to be fine in your biblical studies, but you may sound a little bit you may sound a little bit less than learned if you pronounce it that way. So I would encourage you to try to work on pronouncing it in the back of your throat, like reish, reish. But because of the similarity to the English sound it is transliterated using the English letter R. And examples of Hebrew words that begin with reish include rosh, meaning head, and regel, meaning foot. Rosh, regel. You can hear I'm still having a hard time pronouncing it. I'm still working on it. And this is the last of our letters that is treated as guttural. It's treated as a guttural, but it's not technically one. But you can remember it as a guttural for the purpose of those special rules that you'll learn in future lectures. The next letter is the letter sin or sin. And this makes the sound that the letter S makes in the English word sin or sat or sop, which is the same sound that is made by samech, and it is for that reason transliterated using the English letter S, but to distinguish it from samech, it has a up and to the right pointing accent called an acute accent above the letter S in transliteration. And Hebrew words that begin with the sin include sadeh, meaning field, and sar, meaning chief. The next consonant is almost identical. The only difference is the placement of that dot. This letter is called shin. Shin. And you might be able to tell by the way that I've pronounced its name, it's not pronounced like the letter S in sat, like seen is. It's pronounced like S and H in the word ship, or shot, or shoot. But because it is almost the exact, it's almost identical to seen in the Hebrew, it is also transliterated using the English letter S. But to distinguish it from the seen, instead of having an upward and to the right pointing acute accent, it instead has a downward pointed caret over the S. So these letters are going to take some work remembering how to transliterate them. You've got 4 consonants now that I've taught you that all are transliterated using the letter S. There's samech, which is transliterated simply with an S. There's tzadi, which is transliterated using an S with a dot under it. There's sin, which is transliterated using an S with an acute accent on top. And there's shin, which is transliterated using the English letter S, but with a downward pointed caret over it. So you'll want to practice those. And examples of Hebrew words that start with a shin include shofar, which is a horn. In fact, the shofar, which is a trumpet, is a trumpet made out of a ram's horn. And one more example is shir, meaning song. Now, I said that seen and sheen are extremely identical. The only difference is the placement of the dot. So how can we tell seen and sheen apart? How can you get used to telling the 2 letters apart? Well, one way is to remember the following mnemonic. The sun sets in the west. The sun sets in the west. The reason why this mnemonic might help you is because the sun and the word sets both start with the sound S that seen makes, and we associate the west with the direction left, which is the side of seen that the dot is on the top of. So if you remember that the sun sets in the west, you can remember that the dot is on the left side of the seen. That's the idea. And then, of course, the dot would be on the other side of the sheen. So that's how you can remember how to tell apart seen and sheen. Now, as far as the order of these 2 letters in the Alef-Bet, most of your biblical Hebrew grammars are going to list seen first and sheen second, and I think that's also going to be the case with many Hebrew lexicons, dictionaries of biblical Hebrew. But Jewish children, when they are taught the order of the Alef-Bet, are often taught it the other way around. And that's because there really is no standard order of them. And that might be because, as we talked about in the beginning of this video, some ways of counting the Hebrew consonants don't even differentiate between seen and shin. They treat them as a single consonant, shin, that is just pronounced differently depending upon which side the dot is on. So don't fret over remembering which comes first, seen or shin. That's not important. Just remember how to tell them apart. That's the important part. Last consonant in the Hebrew Alef-Bet is taf. Tav. Tav makes the sound of the English letter T in toy or ton or, touche, although that's obviously not an English word. It is transliterated using the English letter T, and examples of Hebrew words that begin with tav include Torah, meaning law. The Old Testament is sometimes referred to as the Torah by Jewish people. Other times, in other times it only refers to the first 5 books of the Old Testament. In fact, just for your information, many Jewish people refer to the Old Testament as their Tanakh, which is a mnemonic. The T, the N, and the KH in Tanakh each refers to a portion of the Old Testament, with the T corresponding to Torah, meaning the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So Torah is one word, and another word that starts with tav with a dagesh lene includes tachat, meaning under or below. This is the last consonant in our list of Begad Kafat consonants, and this is one of those consonants that in modern speaking is not pronounced any differently than when it does have a dagesh. Although many grammars will tell you that it's pronounced like th in thin. Now you can decide whether you want to pronounce tav with a dagesh differently from tav without a dagesh. You can pronounce them t and th respectively, if you so choose, but most modern Hebrew speakers do not, with the exception of some dialects. So I'll leave that choice to you. Either way, it is transliterated like the tav with the dagesh is, that is, with the English letter T, but to indicate that it is missing the dagesh, it has a line under the T. And like the other letters in the Begad Kafat category, this letter will not usually be at the beginning of a word if it doesn't have a dagesh. One exception is when it follows the word and after the word and, the word teven means straw. It also means that same word, but with the dagesh also means straw. I'm just saying this is an example where I've seen it in the Bible following the word and, in which case it will lack the dagesh and it means straw, teven. Or if you follow the pronunciation that many grammars tell you, theven, like you're speaking with a lisp or something. But like I said, that's not how most modern Hebrew speakers pronounce it. So that is the entire Hebrew Alef-Bet. You can obviously watch this video a number of times to refresh your memory on each of these consonants, but let me give you some suggestions on how to memorize the Alef-Bet. Again, if you choose to follow along in the grammar for this lecture series, Basics of Biblical Hebrew by Pratico and Van Pelt, there will be additional information there that you might find useful. And they'll have some advanced information that I won't be covering. I will also cover some advanced information that it does not, so don't think that you're missing anything super critical by not following along in the grammar. But what I want to do here at the end of the lecture is encourage you with some suggestions on how to memorize the Alef-Bet. And the first recommendation I have is to create and practice flashcards, where each letter of the Alef-Bet is on the flashcard. Now, one way to create those flashcards would be to write them out in Hebrew, and that's a very good way to do it. For those of you who are, spent your whole lives typing, practically, you may prefer to type, and learning how to type Hebrew can be a little bit of a challenge. So if you don't want to try to learn how to type Hebrew, and if you don't want to write out Hebrew Alef-Bet flashcards, you can use my Quizlet flashcard deck for the consonants, which is at the URL on your screen. It's just tinyurl.com/cdate-alef-bet. Excuse me, and that will redirect you to my Quizlet flashcard set. If you don't know, Quizlet is a fantastic service that allows you to create and practice and test yourself on flashcards with virtually limitless possibilities. It's really fantastic and highly recommended. It's got a great phone app, and I can't speak highly enough about it. So if you don't want to take the time to create your own flashcards, feel free to use mine. The other thing that you could do to memorize the Alef-Bet is to learn a children's Alef-Bet song and just sing it to yourself often. I've given you links to three examples on the slide here. The third one, incidentally, is an example from Sesame Street, where the Hebrew Alef-Bet is sung in Sesame Street. But I like the first two better, and this is a really helpful way to memorize the Alef-Bet, and I find myself once, twice, or even more than that times a day in my head or out loud singing the Alef-Bet song. It's catchy and it helps to reinforce your memory. So that's what I would encourage you to do. Number one, use flashcards, and number two, learn a children's Alef-Bet song. Now, all that's going to do is help you remember the names of the letters in the order that they're typically listed in, but it won't help you to identify them on sight. So for that, you're going to need to practice writing the Alef-Bet with pen or pencil and paper, or type. That is an option. I'm just not listing it here. I plan to do a separate video on how to learn how to type in Hebrew. And make sure that as you are learning how to practice writing the Alef-Bet, you're using the block script, the square script that I first introduced you to and that you saw all throughout the video. After you've mastered the Alef-Bet in the block or square print, feel free to try to memorize cursive or handwritten Hebrew. Maybe even ancient Hebrew, if you're so inclined. But for most of your biblical studies, you just need to know that familiar square or block print, so practice with that. Now, if you want to know how people recommend that you write the different strokes in the Hebrew consonants, here are some helpful tutorials that you can find on YouTube. Lastly, in order to memorize how to transliterate Hebrew and how to mentally map transliterated Hebrew back into original Hebrew, practice this standardized transliteration. The flashcards will help you if you either use mine or make your own and include the transliteration on the card. But I would recommend actually practicing transliteration, and only consonants at this point, of course. After lecture 2, you'll be able to practice using vowels, but for the time being, you'll only be transliterating consonants. And one really easy way to do this is to just find consonantal Hebrew, that is the Hebrew with only the consonants rendered, not the vowel markings, and transliterate into English from those consonants. And you can find the consonantal Hebrew for free online at places like the link that I've got here on the slide. But don't just practice from Hebrew into English transliterating. Also go from the transliterations back into consonantal Hebrew. So reverse, and one way to practice that, a super easy way if you followed the previous step that I recommended, is to reverse transliterate the Hebrew that you transliterated. So you take the consonantal Hebrew, you transliterate into English, and then you put away the consonantal Hebrew for a moment, reverse transliterate the English back into Hebrew, and then compare and make sure that you end up with what you started with. That's going to be a helpful way. So if you practice transliteration in ways like these, you'll master the transliteration, and you'll be able to, when you're reading resources that use transliterated Hebrew rather than the actual Hebrew script, you'll be able to mentally map the letters to the Hebrew consonants, and that'll be very helpful. So that's it for this first lecture in Biblical Hebrew 101 on the Alef-Bet. In the next lecture, lecture number 2, I'll be covering vowels and associated information. I don't know when I'll have that up, maybe in another week or so. If you have any comments, suggestions, criticisms, if you identify any mistakes, any advice, anything like that, please feel free to comment in the comment section below on YouTube, or shoot me an email at the email shown on your screen right now. But otherwise, thanks for joining me for today. I hope it's been helpful and has sparked your interest in learning Biblical Hebrew. And with that, I will say shalom, which not only means hello, as I told you at the beginning, but can also mean goodbye. Shalom. I've been your host, Chris Date, and thanks so much for watching The Apologetics, where we think together through what we believe, why we believe it, and not something else. If you've enjoyed this episode, please click the thumbs up, like icon, the subscribe button, and the bell icon to receive notifications when new videos are streamed or uploaded. Either way, come back in 2 weeks for the next episode of The Apologetics, streaming live on YouTube every other Monday at 6 p.m. Pacific. Until then...